Special brew, for my lovely wife. The aroma hit Sarah even before Mark entered the kitchen. A faint malic temps that subtly cut through the usual comforting scent of morning coffee. It wasn't overtly strong, but to Sarah's keen senses, it felt acrid, utterly unlike the rich, earthy notes she associated with her daily ritual. She watched him, a knot tightening in her stomach, as he approached her with a wide, almost too bright smile, holding 2 steaming mugs. Mark chirped, his eyes sparkling with an unsettling intensity. He placed a mug on the counter in front of her, the strange scent, though subtle, intensifying. Her breath hitched. Something was terribly wrong with the coffee itself. An oddity she couldn't quite place, prompting a vague unease rather than outright suspicion of Mark. Their marriage had been a slow, agonizing unraveling. What began with passion had curdled into a bitter cocktail of resentment and unspoken animosity. For months, they'd been living under the same roof, 2 strangers sharing a bed, their conversations clipped and filled with veiled barbs. Sarah had finally found the courage to consider divorce. The words forming a heavy lump in her throat each time she thought of speaking them aloud. She suspected Mark knew. He'd been acting strangely, overly solicitous one moment, chillingly distant the next. Just then, her sister-in-law, Diana, sauntered into the kitchen. Her usual morning air of entitled nonchalance escaping her lips. Diana, Mark's younger sister, was a permanent fixture in their lives, an irritating, freeloading presence, who had overstayed her welcome by about 5 years. Not only did she drain their resources, but she also delighted in spreading subtle, poisonous rumors about Sarah behind her back, chipping away at Sarah's reputation among their mutual acquaintances. Sarah loathed her, and the feeling was mutual. "Morning, darling," Diana drawled, eyeing Sarah's untouched mug, still brewing that tasteless sludge. "Mark, you really need to upgrade your beans." A flicker of an idea, desperate and dangerous, ignited in Sarah's mind. It was reckless, born of panic, and a lifetime of suppressed frustration, over Diana's presence, and the odd-smelling coffee, but it felt like the only way out of drinking something that just didn't smell right. She had no inkling, not a single thought, that there was anything truly dangerous or nefarious in the brew. Merely that it was an unpleasant concoction she wished to avoid. As Mark turned to retrieve something from the fridge, Sarah's hand shot out. With a swift, almost imperceptible movement, she swapped her mug with Diana's. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of guilt, an illicit thrill over her petty act. Diana, oblivious, reached for her usual cup, now Sarah's intended target, and took a long noisy gulp. She didn't seem to notice anything amiss, merely a slight frown appearing on her face. She paused, a frown creasing her forehead. Tastes different today. A bit bland, maybe." Diana shrugged, taking another sip. "Oh well, I'm off anyway. Got to do things." She sauntered out of the kitchen, muttering under her breath about Mark's inconsistent coffee. 10 minutes later, a blood-curdling scream tore through the silence of the house. Sarah and Mark rushed out to find Diana writhing on the living room floor, her face a ghastly shade of green, clutching her stomach. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. "Diana, what's wrong?" Mark exclaimed, his voice laced with a raw, undeniable panic that Sarah had never heard before. His eyes darted between Diana and Sarah, wide with a terrifying realization. The coffee." He stammered, then seemed to catch himself, quickly adding, "What did you drink, Diana?" The coffee." Diana gasped, her eyes rolling back in her head. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Sarah's initial shock. This wasn't just a bad stomachache. This was serious. Mark, surprisingly, was the one who called for an ambulance, his hands trembling visibly as he fumbled with his phone. His voice surprisingly strained as he relayed Diana's symptoms. The paramedics arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgent voices. Diana was quickly stabilized enough to be transported to the nearest hospital. Sarah and Mark followed in their car, a suffocating silence filling the space between them. Sarah felt a tremor run through her. What had Mark put in that coffee? And what had she done? At the hospital, the emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos. Diana was rushed into a cubicle, doctors and nurses swarming around her. Hours crawled by. Sarah sat in the waiting room, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a horrifying sense of responsibility. Mark sat beside her, his face pale and clammy, a stark contrast to his earlier blank expression. He kept running a hand through his hair, his leg bouncing nervously. At the hospital, the emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos. Diana was rushed into a cubicle, doctors and nurses swarming around her. Hours crawled by. Sarah sat in the waiting room, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a horrifying sense of responsibility. Mark sat beside her, his face pale and clammy, a stark contrast to his earlier blank expression. He kept running a hand through his hair, his leg bouncing nervously. Finally, a hurried-looking doctor emerged. His expression was grim. "Ms. Diana Miller has been stabilized, but she is in critical condition. We ran some tests, and we found traces of a highly potent neurotoxin in her system. It appears she was poisoned." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Poison. Her eyes involuntarily flickered to Mark, who now looked genuinely terrified. "Poison," Mark repeated, his voice barely a whisper, a stark shift from his earlier feigned shock. That's impossible." He swallowed hard, his gaze flickering away from Sarah. The doctor's gaze narrowed. "The police have been notified. This is now a criminal investigation." The arrival of Detective Miller and Sergeant Chen shattered any remaining pretense of normalcy. They questioned Sarah and Mark separately, their inquiries methodical and probing. Sarah recounted the morning, including the moment she swapped the mugs. She explained about the strange smell of her coffee and her petty, impulsive decision to switch it with Diana's, emphasizing that she had absolutely no idea it contained anything harmful. She felt a profound sense of shame and terror. Diana was a nuisance, but she hadn't wished death upon her. The police investigation quickly honed in on the coffee. The remaining brew in the pot, the mugs, everything was taken for forensic analysis. A search warrant was executed for their house. Sarah watched, numb, as officers meticulously combed through their home, collecting samples. Days turned into a suffocating week. Diana remained in a coma, her condition touch and go. The police continued their interrogations. Sarah could feel their suspicion mounting, particularly towards Mark. They seemed to have an uncanny ability to connect dots she hadn't even realized existed. Then came the bombshell. Detective Miller called Sarah in for another interview. His voice was grave. "Mrs. Miller, we've uncovered some disturbing information. Your husband, Mark, recently took out a substantial life insurance policy on you. A very large one. And we've found evidence that your marriage has been under significant strain. You were, in fact, contemplating divorce, weren't you?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The strange coffee she'd noticed, Mark's unsettling demeanor, the enormous life insurance policy, her unspoken plans for divorce, and the undeniable fact that he had made the coffee specifically for her. She had simply been avoiding an unpleasant taste, completely unaware of the deadly intent behind it. He was trying to poison me," Sarah whispered, the realization a cold, hard stone in her gut. Detective Miller nodded slowly. "All signs point to it. The poison found in Ms. Diana Miller's system matches a rare substance that your husband had recently researched online. We also found a purchase order for a small quantity of it, disguised as a chemical for a hobby project. The timing, the insurance, your impending divorce, it all paints a very clear picture." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. Mark hadn't been making her a special brew at all. He had been planning her murder. He saw her not as his wife, but as an obstacle, a means to an end, a payout. Their broken relationship, her desire for freedom, had apparently pushed him to the most extreme measure imaginable. Within hours, Mark was arrested. The evidence, though circumstantial in some aspects, was overwhelmingly against him, especially with Diana's testimony. If she recovered, the special brew was a lethal concoction meant to end her life and secure his future. Lying in bed that night, the house eerily silent without Mark or Diana, Sarah couldn't sleep. The image of the two mugs, so innocent yet one containing a deadly secret, replayed in her mind. Her impulsive, spiteful act of swapping them had inadvertently saved her life. She had simply wanted to avoid an unpleasant cup of coffee and, in a petty moment, passed it off to her sister-in-law, never for a second suspecting it would cause serious harm. Instead, she had uncovered a meticulously planned, cold-blooded attempt on her own life. The bitterness of betrayal settled deep in Sarah's soul, a stark reminder of her narrow escape. Diana, surprisingly, pulled through. Sarah visited her in the hospital, tears welling, as she confessed, swapping the mugs, emphasizing her ignorance of the poison. Diana, still hazy, showed a flicker of understanding. and their shared ordeal transcended their past animosity. Sarah had saved herself, tragically at Diana's expense, realizing the terrifying truth of her husband's lethal intentions.